as well. And we do that kind of through different events and activities. But if anyone would like to know more about the society, we will be posting a link on the chat, so you can find out more, and you can also sign up for updates on our events that are coming up. But so today we are on the second day of the Global Climate Change Week. So that runs from the 19th to the 25th of October. And the aim of the week is to encourage academics and students and universities to engage with each other and kind of throughout the whole wider community about climate change action and different solutions to that. So as a part of that week, ENSA has planned for a lot of different events, and one of those events is the one tonight. We'll also post a link on the ENSA's webpage where you can find all those events as well. But tonight's event will be delivered wonderful Mark Huxham. A lot of you probably know him, but he is a professor of teaching and research in environmental biology here at Napier. He's done his PhD on estuary food webs and worked nearly 2 decades on local communities, particularly in Kenya, to better understand mangrove ecosystems and how these can be restored and used for bringing community development benefits. Today, however, Mark will be giving us a brief overview of the state of climate change science and what are some of the main ways in which denial of the science occurs, and also what the consequences of this are. After this, we'll have time for discussion and some questions as well. So without further blabber and ado, I will pass on to Mark.
Thanks very much, Amelia, and thanks everybody for coming along. It's great to see you. I'm going to try and keep the chat open. Sometimes my internet's a bit dodgy, so do let me know if you can't hear me. But if you give me a thumbs up, Heloise, are you hearing me okay? That's brilliant. Okay, so I'm going to leave the video off, but I am going to share a screen, which should come anytime now. Okay, so I'm hoping everybody can see that. What I'd like to do, I was going to say this isn't a lecture, but I guess it is. It is a lecture. Sorry, guys, especially if you spent the day in a lecture. I'm not going to go on too long, about 20 minutes. And you're very welcome to just butt in at any time. If I'm unclear or if you want to ask any questions, just go ahead. I know it's difficult in this format, but just be brave and do that if you need to. So what I thought might be helpful would be to run through very quickly some of the background science. And as Amelia said, I've been working in well, not exactly climate science, but science that's relevant to climate change for more than 20 years now, particularly on carbon sinks in mangroves. So it's part of my professional life, and I've been campaigning on it for almost 40 years. So despite that, I guess some people are still a little uncertain about the basics of the science. So I want to just very quickly run through the foundational science. And then I want to talk about some of the categories of the people who are denying that science and its implications. And some of them are kind of obvious to us, I suppose, and you might be able to predict a few of the species of denier that I'm going to discuss. But some are a bit less obvious, and I would argue that many of us, including many scientists, indulge in various forms of climate change denial, sometimes for good reasons. But I want to talk a little bit about that. And then I want to finish on what I hope is a more optimistic note, in particular about the importance of taking positive action in the face of this really significant challenge. So I want to share just a few slides about some of the work that I've been doing, and that's not to make any kind of claim that I'm fixing climate change. It's really more for psychological purposes that I've found working in this area, teaching this area, researching this area, that for my own psychological health, it's really important that I'm doing at least something that might make things a little bit better. So I want to share that with you. So I'm going to start not with climate change at all, but with one of the fundamental drivers of climate change, and that's human beings. In particular, it's the number of human beings. So the number of human beings isn't the only factor, of course, it's what those human beings do, and those two things are very closely linked. But if we want to understand how human beings are transforming the planet, we need to understand human population. So here's human population growth over the last century, and there's the projection in orange about what's going to happen to the human population. So that's the United Nations demographic projection up to 2100. And you can see that the UN is estimating that human population will go to just over 10 billion, about 10.5 billion people by the end of this century. And at the moment it's 7.5 billion. But importantly, so apart from totally catastrophic apocalyptic scenarios, all demographers agree that there will be more humans, and significantly many billions of more humans on the planet during your lifetimes. I hope during your lifetimes, as in I hope many of you will live to see that. But importantly, there's a great deal of uncertainty in that projection. So I've just put the range of projections from the UN high projection there to the UN low projection there, and that's about 2.5 billion, more than 2.5 billion difference in that range. And the key criteria that determines where that will go is, well, individual choice, but those individual choices are framed by political choices, and in particular they're framed by what women choose to do. If women have more choice over their reproduction, in most of the world, many millions of women would still choose, if you ask them, to have fewer children than they have. So reproductive choice and female emancipation is really critical in where we end up on that diagram. So that's one of the key drivers, the number of people, and of course how much those people are consuming. Most people don't consume very much in the world. In fact, about half of the world's carbon emissions come from about 11% of its population. So I don't want to imply that numbers are the only thing, but they're a factor. One of the impacts then of increasing human numbers on the planet are loss of species. And there's a reason why Extinction Rebellion, for example, calls itself Extinction Rebellion rather than climate rebellion or climate emergency, because these two things are very closely related. So although we talk a lot, sometimes obsessively, about climate change, it's linked to the other big biological crisis that's going on, which is loss of species. So I'm just going to try and give you an illustration of what's going on with biodiversity on the planet. And conservation biologists measure extinction rates in million species years. And what that means is if you take 1 million species and then go forward a year, how many of those species have gone extinct? How many of that million? So we can look at the geological record, and paleontologists can calculate average rates of extinction from the geological record. And this is the average rate. So each one of those larks represents one species, and over 1 million years, we'd have on average, we'd have 0.1 million species year extinctions. So that's the average rate in the geological record. Here's the rate over the last 50 or so years as calculated by conservation biologists. So unfortunately, we're running about 1,000 times faster than the background geological rate of extinction, which means we're entering this period of mass extinctions, equivalent, possibly, if we're unlucky, possibly equivalent to some of those huge geological mass extinctions that we've seen in the past that finished off things like the dinosaurs. Extinction, we focus on extinctions because they're really dramatic, because once a species is gone, it's disappeared forever. But underlying extinctions is the loss of just numbers. So you could have, after all, you could have a species which only has 5% of its individuals left. It hasn't gone extinct yet, but it's become very rare. And WWF and other groups produce something called the Living Planet Index, which tracks the numbers of individuals in more than 10,000 populations of 3,000 species. And these are species which include birds and mammals and reptiles and insects. And what's quite remarkable, really, is that there's been this huge decline over the last 50 years, not just in the number of species, but in the number of things, just the number of living things that aren't human beings or human vassals like cows. So when you speak to your mum and your dad, or perhaps your grandparents, and they say, oh, I remember, seeing all these wildflowers, or I remember seeing lots of butterflies, or I remember driving along and having to get out and wipe my windscreen of my car to remove all the insects that have been crushed on the windscreen. Those are not just the mad jabberings of the senile old fools. Those are true. It's really true that there's just far, far fewer living things, non-human things around on the planet than there were. So that's a crisis that's been driven partly by climate change, and climate change is going to make it much worse. So a little bit on climate change. Here's what's happening with carbon dioxide. It's showing a pretty relentless rise as measured in Hawaii. They measure it in Hawaii because it's a long way from any industrial pollution. And what that means is that the temperature on the planet is going up. So the top graph there shows temperature, or so-called temperature anomaly, which is the difference of temperature from some baseline, some pre-industrial baseline. And this is driving lots of other changes on the planet. So changes like loss of sea ice, of course, and a rise in sea level. So sea levels are going up by about 3.3 millimeters per year around the planet on average. So what are human beings doing about this, this science? Well, the most high profile thing they're doing about it is getting together and agreeing international agreements. So I often show this picture because I really like it. It's a friend of mine, Judith, planting some mangroves. And one of the things we're doing is trying to adapt to the changes. Planting mangroves might help resist that sea level rise a little bit. So that's a local level, but on the biggest stage, the biggest international stage, the United Nations is arranging its response to climate change. And that culminated most recently in the Paris Agreement. And this was a huge success of international diplomacy, because it got the world to sign up to, or the signatories to the Paris Agreement, 197 different nations signed up to an agreement to limit temperature rises to 2 degrees, and to strive to make efforts, to pursue efforts to limit temperature increases to 1.5 degrees. And that was a really important and significant commitment. But of course, it's relatively easy to sign up to commitments. It's much harder to actually enact them. And let's just look what that commitment means. This is comment from Kevin Anderson, who's one of the most prominent climate modelers in the UK. And for us to have a chance of keeping below 2 degrees, we're not talking about 1.5, but if we want to keep below 2 degrees, we need to limit the total amount of carbon that we emit into the atmosphere in this century to 1,000 gigatons. A gigaton is a billion tons. So that's 1,000 billion tons of carbon. That sounds like a lot, but in fact, since the start of the century, we've already emitted about 350 gigatons of that budget. So we've only got about 650 gigatons left to spend, if you like. And so what that means is that we need to start reducing emissions of carbon so that emissions are reducing by about 10% by 2025. And that leads us to essentially zero carbon in the economy and in the energy system in particular by 2050. So that's the kind of challenge that we're facing. And to put that into context, we've never had a year like the one we're living through, of course, either individually or collectively or globally. It's the first year for 3 decades, it's the first year since the financial crash that carbon emissions have gone down a little bit. And by the end of this year, they may have decreased by something like 5%. So even in this extraordinary year, we're not quite reaching the levels that we need to reach to stay within 2 degrees. Notice we're talking about 2 degrees, not 1.5. What happens when we get to 1.5 and 2 degrees warmer? Here's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 2018 report. The IPCC is the go-to place for credible climate science, international climate science. So they're the international body that advises governments, and all their material is made publicly available. So you can get any of this material from their websites. And this diagram just summarizes some of the predicted and realizing effects on key sectors and ecosystems. The dark purple is kind of disastrous effects, and the light yellow is sort of moderate effects. So you can see over on the left of this diagram, there's warm water corals. So the corals that most people know about, things like the Barrier Reef in Australia. And here we are, we're already at 1 degree, and that VH stands for very high certainty. And so what the IPCC is saying is after 1 degree, you get into very severe effects on warm water corals. And we can see that happening. If you might have seen recently on the news, actually, the Barrier Reef is suffering about 30% bleaching at the moment. So given that it's very unlikely that we will stay to 1.5 degrees, it looks like warm water corals, they may not go extinct, but the big coral reefs that we're aware of are almost certainly doomed. And that's a really depressing prediction, but it's based on very good science, and we have to be able to kind of look that in the face. Other areas, the Arctic area is predicted to really suffer from climate change and already is, and things like coastal flooding and small-scale, low-altitude fisheries. So some of these areas are really vulnerable. And I guess what this diagram brings home is that although 1.5 is probably not achievable now, we need very rapid change. Even achieving 1.5 is not a good outcome. We'll still have very major effects on the world's ecosystems and on human beings around the world. So we're looking at quite a difficult future. So what about the response, our political and personal response to this challenge that we've known about for at least 60 years now? There's lots of kinds of denial going on of these facts. I've given you 4 types of denial here. So the one represented by Trump is not, you could say it's not a denial, not climate change denial at all. You might call it more bullshit than denial. And I'm using that term technically in the way that the philosopher Harry Frankfurt used it. So Frankfurt defined bullshit as different from lying. So the bullshitter isn't interested in reality. The liar studies reality and then crafts a story that might fit with reality, whereas the bullshitter just doesn't care for whatever reason. So Trump is like that, really. He doesn't, if you listen to what he says about climate change, it doesn't make any sense. It's not even an attempt to lie. It's just bullshit. And it kind of, I suppose it sends a message to people who think they can just ignore climate change, or it sends a kind of cultural message. So there's bullshitters, that's one kind of denial. And then there's something a bit more sophisticated, a bit more traditional anyway. There's denial of facts and denial of consensus. So you might deny the facts, or you might deny that people agree that they're the facts. So Exxonmobil's an example of that. And we'll come back to Exxonmobil. There's another type of denial represented by Bjørn Lomborg there. He's a Danish economist who kind of accepts the facts about climate change, but argues that it's not all that bad, not all that important. Or if it is important, it's not as important as other things like poverty. So he sort of implies that if you spend your time worried about climate change, then you'll be distracted from worrying about poverty. And then on the bottom there is Paul Kingsnorth, and Paul Kingsnorth is he was a climate change activist and a green campaigner, and he certainly knows a lot about climate change, and he doesn't deny the facts at all. But he now thinks we're in a state where society, our civilization, cannot be saved. He thinks we passed the point of no return, and so he runs or helps run a movement called of dark ecology, which is basically trying to come to terms with the end of civilization. And he, lives off grid using a composting toilet in the west of Ireland. So I think his position is also a kind of denial. I think it's a denial of hope, because I think he goes too far. So just to explore some of these denials a little bit more. This is a common type of denial used by at least the denialists who engage a little bit with the facts. So it's quite common, or used to be. This isn't so common anymore because it's a bit laughable. But if you take the trend in temperature, for example, the overall trend over the last 50 years, it's very clear and unarguable. But if you choose to cherry pick small bits of this data, for example, the point there going to down there, it looks like the temperature is declining, and the same there, and the same there. So if you're careful and you pick your start and your end, and you don't look too hard, you can fabricate. Okay, it's lying with the data, and some denialists use that kind of trick. Here's some interesting research on Exxonmobil, one of the world's largest oil companies, fossil fuel companies, and they're one of the worst in terms of their record of climate change obfuscation and denial. So this was a fairly recent paper in 2017, and what these two authors did was they gathered together all the information they could from Exxonmobil, including public statements, so things like advertorials. These were Exxonmobil like paying the New York Times to run these big adverts which had information in them. So those were for public consumption, but they also got hold of private internal documents, so papers written by Exxonmobil scientists, for example, and sent to the chief executive and so on. And so they classified these documents going from the left to the right in increasing amounts of public accessibility. So these internal documents, they're not for public view. They just managed to get hold of them. There are peer-reviewed papers published by scientists based with Exxonmobil. And those, well, lots of the public find it hard to access scientific papers because they're behind firewalls or they're just hard to understand. And then there's non-peer-reviewed reports that might be on websites, a bit more accessible, and then basically adverts which are designed for the public. And what this figure shows is the green is the proportion of those documents that support mainstream science on climate change. And the red is the proportion of those documents that dispute mainstream science on climate change or suggest that it's not a consensus. So basically, Exxonmobil knew exactly, they know all about climate change, all their internal documents agree with the mainstream science, but all their adverts disagree with it. You might think that's obvious, but I still find it really shocking that they were doing that. They claim not to be doing it anymore, but that's what they get up to. So they're spreading doubt. That's their business. They try and spread doubt. Just another kind of interesting form of denial, I think. It's a sort of philosophical distraction, this one, and I call it the geological fallacy. So some people argue that because climate has changed in the past, then it doesn't matter that it's changing now, and it's caused, the changes we see at the moment are caused by nature, not human beings, and that's a really sort of silly climate change denial. It's a bit like shooting somebody and then claiming that their death wasn't caused by a bullet, it was caused by measles because deaths have been caused by measles in the past. So I'm not really addressing that kind of denial because it's just silly. This is a bit more subtle, I think, psychologically, and it's something that quite a lot of scientists believe or purport to believe. And it's the idea that because in the long history of the Earth, we've had periods that have been much hotter than now. Back in the Carboniferous, there was no ice on the planet, for example. We've also had periods that have been much colder. Somehow climate change driven by human beings doesn't matter because in the long run, well, humans won't be around and, the world will just carry on. And I'm not sure if people really feel this or whether they're kind of consoling themselves. I don't find it consoling at all because in the long run, we're all dead. And in the very long run, the universe is dead too. So the idea that what matters to us only matters because it persists forever is quite a strange philosophical idea. In fact, I think almost the opposite. I think what matters to us are things that don't live for very long, and that's why they matter. They're vulnerable. So things like human beings living good lives and the people we love are the things that matter. I'm going to take you briefly then to East Africa. Here's Gramsci village, and I've been working there for about 20 years now, and I started working there very much as a scientist interested in finding scientific facts. But what the people in the village challenged me to do was to say, how can your research help us and help our local environment? They were very explicit about that. And so I was forced really to look for ways in which I could use science to generate funds that help conservation and help local development. And so because I'm working on mangrove forests, and mangroves are very powerful carbon sinks, it allows me to get involved in offsetting carbon, selling carbon to raise money for mangrove conservation. And that allows us to invest in things like schools and water projects in the village. And it's also really nice because that work has involved many hundreds of volunteers, including many hundreds of, not hundreds, but many, many dozens of Edinburgh Napier students. So it means we're working with lots of different people, all bringing their own skills and their own passions, which is a really nice way of doing science and a really optimistic way of doing science. So I found that's been very important for me psychologically because talking about climate change is depressing. And I found, teaching it is really depressing. I don't want to spend my time talking to bright young people and telling them the world is getting worse, and leaving people depressed. But at the same time, I have to face up to the scientific reality. So this last slide just kind of summarizes, or penultimate slide summarizes some of the things I think we need to do about climate change. All of these interventions can make a difference. And you can see offsetting I'm involved with is just a small part of that. So women's health, walking and cycling, renewable energy, reducing the amount of meat we eat in our diets, energy efficiency. But above them all, the big one, the really big and important one, is changing our society. We have to work together. We have to work politically and collectively to change our society, because we individually can make hardly any difference. We should still do that for our own integrity and also for our own sense of worth and optimism. But we need to work together to change society and to challenge climate change denial. This is my last slide now. So I've put a slide up of Gramsci. Gramsci was an Italian Marxist who died in Mussolini's jail. So he's been an inspiration for many people over many years, and he's perhaps most famous for this aphorism, and I find it very important and quite moving. So, pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. Gramsci argued that that's how we need to live our lives, particularly in the face of major social challenges and political challenges. And what that means is pessimism of the intellect is we need to be skeptical, we need to be hard-nosed, we need to look at the evidence and use the best science that we have. But at the same time, we need optimism of the will. We need to work on being optimistic. And will implies we have to work at it. It's not going to come if we just sit back and get depressed, then we won't do anything. So it's a virtue that we have to work at. And what this implies, I think, for climate change and doing something about climate change is we can't sit around for perfect solutions. So we mustn't allow perfection to be the enemy of the good. We move forward with what we think might work. We try multiple different approaches. Some might work, some might not. That's okay if they don't work, but we have to be open and admit that they're not working and try different approaches. This is quite highfalutin language, I know, but we're not waiting for history to turn up a savior for us. That idea in history crops up in lots of different types of philosophies. It crops up in perhaps some Christian theology that, we'll be saved in the future. It crops up in Marxist thinking, the revolution will come along and save us. It crops up in techno-optimism. Everything will be okay because somebody will invent some great science that will get us out of this difficulty. We mustn't do that. And then we act for the good. So we act according to the good. So act according to our values. We have to decide what our values are and go forward and act on them, and not find ourselves wallowing in pessimism or cynicism, because I think Kingsnorth is wrong. I think kind of cynicism is a form of denial too, and I think there's still chances for us to make the world better.
That's great, Mark. Thanks very much. That was very interesting. We have time for questions and discussion, so feel free to pop any questions on the chat or then just fire them away.
I've got a first question to kick off the discussion, if that's okay. So you spoke at the beginning, Mark, about how population is increasing year on year, and I wanted to know what your thoughts were on population control and policies such as the one that China had about the one-child policy, and sort of, do you think that's a solution? Do you think that's right? Because there's also lots of ethical questions behind, imposing that kind of thing on people.
Thanks very much, Heloisa, and I'm sure other people have thoughts on this and do come in. It's a really controversial topic, isn't it? And people, I said I've been involved in these areas for a long time, including in green activism, and most mainstream green activists in the UK really don't want to talk about population, and that's for some good reasons. So, for example, the National Front, the old fascist organisation in the UK, had a strong population policy, and many far-right parties across Europe talk a lot about population, although usually when they do that, or often when they do that, they're thinking about people with brown skins rather than white ones. So it has that connotation, unfortunately, the historical link with racism. And it also has that link, as you said, Heloisa, to kind of oppressive authoritarianism in China. However, my own view is that we cannot just ignore human numbers because they're so massive. And if we do ignore them, then kind of essentially there's no way that we can have a sustainable planet with 12 billion people living a lifestyle like our own. So are we saying we've given up on a sustainable planet, or are we saying it's okay for us in the rich West, the top billion, if you like, to live our lifestyles and everybody else stay poor? That's hardly an ethical position either. So there's a good solution to this, though, which is that it turns out most human geographers and demographers would agree that the best way, the most effective way, unless you're a totally authoritarian regime or there's a hideous disease, we shouldn't talk about that, but the most effective way of reducing population growth is to empower women, to give women choices, in particular choices around their own reproduction, but more broadly than that, just increase the social status of women. So many women across the world have more children than they would choose, and many people, the poor, have more children than they would choose because they're trying to have an insurance policy for their old age because there's no social security for people. So actually you can square the circle. What you want is people living, high quality lives with lots of social security and empowerment for women. And that's what we need if we want to address population.
Great, thanks, Mark. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think what's interesting with those kind of questions is that there's not a sort of a one answer to it, and I think that's what maybe some people want to make others believe, that this is the solution, and it's there's lots of different things that will lead to that as well. So I've got there's a question in the chat from Ankit as well, and so he's asking, what do you think is what would you think is missing at Edinburgh Napier University in regards to climate action? Do you think that the university is doing enough, or that it could be doing better? And do you think that also the changes that Edinburgh Napier and maybe other universities as well are doing, do you think that will have a significant impact on climate action and climate change solutions?
Well, I'm really interested in your view and everyone's view on that, because part of that is about the experience of students at the university, a big part of that. And we're having a debate at the moment about, should we expect all students, for example, regardless of their course, to study climate change or some of these issues? Should that be an expectation, or is that imposing on people? I think actually I'm quite proud of the university in the decisions it's made over the last few years, and there's been a lot of work behind the scenes. The university does really well in its estates. So it's got a sustainability officer who's overseen a more than 50% cut in carbon emissions from our estates over the last 15 years or so. So in fact, we're doing really well, but most of that's been hidden behind the scenes. And I think we should make more of that. And we now have a commitment to go carbon zero by no later than 2030. I don't think I was hoping it would be more ambitious than that, and I was doing my best behind the scenes to pressure my colleagues in the university court. The university court, I guess, has to be a little bit cautious because it doesn't want to bankrupt the university. I understand that, but I also think, we need to lead the way. So we need to show leadership on this. So we've got a reasonable target now, and I think with the help of, the student body and the student societies, we can push the university, we can support the university in moving faster on that. Because I want to be proud of where I work. I am proud of where I work, but I want to be prouder. I think it would be great if we were known as a leader in this area.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think as well, from ENSA's perspective, I think, just because, Ankit and I, we're officers and we're not here for, that long in our role. So it's more difficult for us to sort of push for change as well, because as you were saying, the sustainability officer has been doing that for quite a number of years, and then you were there as well. I think for us, sometimes it's, and I guess maybe Emilia from the society will say something similar, that you for example, we was thinking, well, the university should divest from fossil fuels, and we start, which it has from direct investment, but not from indirect investment at the moment. And so we're trying to push for change, but then, because the university processes move quite slow, it can be quite a frustrating thing as well. So I think, at least from my side, I do think that the university is doing quite well, and I think the targets are quite good, and comparing, I think Napier, comparing it to other universities is, I think, would be sort of leading the way in sustainability as well. But I think it has to do with the fact that it is quite a new university as well. It's quite more modern, so it's easier to implement change as well. But yeah, I think there is always more to be done anyway.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with both of you on that. And I suppose, yeah, Eloisa, like you said, that like things obviously they move quite slowly, and it could be quite frustrating, and it could be quite difficult, even though you would have ideas and you're trying to push for the change, but obviously like there's certain things that things just don't happen overnight, and obviously like most of the people are here only for the 4 years unless they go on to do their masters after. So kind of in the long run, it's not that long time to kind of try and do those changes. But I suppose like from the society perspective, what we're kind of trying to do as well, they're trying to kind of get the students involved and kind of maybe be that link between the staff and the decision makers, and bring student ideas kind of forward, because obviously we spend a lot of time at uni, and we might see the things that we feel like should be changed, so we kind of want to bring that forward. But yeah, and like Mike, you said as well about that, having kind of a teaching climate science in other degrees than like purely scientific ones as well, I think is something that has come up in the society as well, and I think is quite a welcomed idea from a lot of different courses. So definitely would be probably a good idea.
I think what's great with the society as well is that even though the students are there for 4 years or less, the society stays as a legacy, and I think that's quite nice, that the actions that other students have taken a couple of years ago, they're still sort of embedded in what your society does, and I think that's what's great, as well, is because it's something that can continue too.
Yeah, definitely, and it's really nice because it still kind of creates, and even though it would be for a year or two that people would get involved, but it still kind of creates that like a positive community feeling, and kind of brings people together, so because it can be quite depressing and it can be quite scary topic, so it's kind of nice that you have people that you can share those with, and talk about those things and try and come up with solutions together.
And I'd want to add, if I could, Emilia, that sometimes working in these societies, you think, oh, this is, there's only a small group of us, and what difference can we make? And this is all sort of hopeless. But I remember when I was a student, I was involved in a campaign against McDonald's, and I used to stand outside McDonald's handing out these terrible photocopied leaflets. They were awful, to lines of people who just threw them away. And I thought, this is totally hopeless. We have no effect whatsoever. But it turned out that campaign then evolved into being the longest libel case in British history. And McDonald's had to change most of their practices after that. So you never know what's going to happen. Greta Thunberg sat on her own outside the Swedish Parliament, and look what happened there. So, small things can make a big difference.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think that even, sometimes I'll think, why would me adding a signature on this petition or me just sending an email to this company about their bad practices, like what difference is just my voice going to make? But then I have actually noticed that there's some things I have done. I've actually created a change in, getting emails back from an organization that had asked me to sign their petition saying, well, we've managed to, we've successfully managed to change this. Or I remember also sending an email to the National Portrait Gallery because they had one of their exhibitions that was sponsored by BP, the oil company. And I remember emailing them saying that I thought that was extremely disappointing, etc. And then I heard back about, obviously it wasn't just because of me, but then I did hear back a month later saying that they had stopped that sponsorship because a lot of people had messaged them saying that they didn't agree with it. So I think it's really nice to get some feedback on that and realize that, that the actions that we take do actually make a difference. So there's another question in the chat from Laszlo. So he's asking, how can we influence big corporations to change their hypocrisy? Because sustainability reports are all voluntary for them. And also, they only write what the stakeholders want to hear. So we read it and say, hey, Shell is so green, and then they report it, so that must be true. But it's actually the opposite. So can we do anything to change that behavior? And because we all know that probably it is those big companies that are the biggest wrongdoers.
Yeah, thanks, Lazo. I can comment on that, although I'm no expert, but it's really difficult, isn't it? Because inside of those big companies are thousands of human beings, and quite a lot of those human beings are perfectly nice people. Some of them are wanting to make the world better as well. So I've had experience, for example, of working quite closely with people from Shell. In fact, some Shell volunteers come on my projects, and I really struggled with that at the start, but it was good to have the conversations with them and to have the opportunity to try and influence Shell. After all, these are the big companies that have the power. Having said that, I think you do have to make a judgment about which companies are redeemable and which are not. In other words, which ones are just lying. So Exxonmobil, for example, as I explained, they're liars, and they've been lying for a long, long time about climate change. They've spent a lot of money lying about climate change. So for me, they're international criminals. They should be in jail, the people behind that campaign. In fact, it's really shocking, isn't it, that they can do that? So I think some companies and some organizations just need to be called out, and you need as high profile as possible campaigning against them. Other companies need to change, we all need to change. And I'll give you one example, which I find really inspiring. Any of you from Scandinavia may know a company called Max Burger. I don't know if you've come across them, Amelia. Apparently, they're the biggest burger company in Sweden, I think. They're like bigger than McDonald's. And so you think, well, they're a burger company. That's probably not too environmental. But about 10 years ago, Max Burger decided they better look at their carbon footprint. And they did this because they wanted to offset. So I know a bit about it because I'm involved in carbon offsetting. And they realized basically that, yes, they could try and offset some carbon, but their fundamental problem was that selling, processed beef burgers or burgers made from beef was fundamentally damaging to the climate. So people need to eat less beef. And they actually realized that, they got that, and so they now sell more than 50% of their burgers are vegetarian or vegan. So they're trying to change their own customer base, and they have a very ambitious target of going carbon neutral. So it's a good example of a really quite a difficult sector. You would think they would, really be in denial, but they're not. They accepted there was an issue, and they're working hard to change it. And I think it's really good for scientists and for activists to engage with companies that are sincere about change. The difficult thing, of course, is figuring out whether they are or not. And I mean, to be fair, a company is not one thing, it's lots of people. And for ourselves as well, we have mixed motives, don't we, as individuals? So we need to do what we can to push the good outcomes and to condemn the bad ones. But I do think that some organizations and perhaps some individuals are probably beyond the pale because we look at their track record.
Thanks, Mark. Also, like when you say that, it makes me think about how now everything is changing in the sense where companies are realizing that being environmentally friendly can also be profitable. And I think that might be one of the things that, that will make companies actually change their behavior, because if they realize, oh, we can make money, or we can even make more money by being sustainable, well then, there's no reason for them not to do it, because ultimately big corporations, that's what their goal is.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I suppose like it's similar to like all this renewable energy, and like the prices are constantly going down. So it is slowly kind of getting to the point that it is, even like from the business perspective, it's just more feasible to kind of go more green.
If anyone has more questions, this is your moment. You can type it in the chat or just unmute yourself as well. If not, I've got it. Emilia, did you say you had a couple of questions maybe?
Yeah, we really have a time for
two.
Yeah.
Actually, there's one in the chat.
Yeah,
That's okay. So I've got a question from Joe, who's saying, what would you suggest students do to try and influence universities to become carbon neutral?
Well, I'm not sure if I'm the expert on that. You might be, Eloisa.
Yeah, I think this is one that all three of us could answer as well. I think that there's a lot. What's interesting with universities is that, and also I'm saying this from a student union perspective, they will, on issues such as this or any other issues that are coming up, they will listen to the students more than they listen to anyone else, really, because students are, the universities are there for the students are their customers. And so if something is coming from the students, then the university will listen. So it's like what we were saying about, for example, integrating climate change into the curriculum. And you were saying, Mark, there's something that you were pushing. It's something that I'm wanting to push as well. But I've heard back from the university saying, well, as long as we're basically saying, as long as we don't see it coming from the student body, it's not something that we're really going to do at the moment, because they want to make sure that it's the students who want this. So I think to answer the questions, things that students can do would be, well, first of all, you can join a society as well, because you'll have more power if you're in a small group instead of an individual. As well, you can speak to different people in the university. So again, Edinburgh Napier has a sustainability team. So you can email them, get in contact, and see maybe find out what they are doing and how maybe you can help them. Then there's also different organizations you can join. For example, there's SOS UK, which is Students Organising for Sustainability. So they push for campaigns such as carbon neutrality, divesting from fossil fuels. And then again, you can get involved with the student union, with the student association as well. So Ankit, who is the president of ENSA, and myself, we're quite committed to sustainability. So if you are a student at Edinburgh Napier and you want to make a change, definitely get in contact with us, because we can have more power as well to help you raise your voice and get in contact with university and just let them know that this is something that you care about. So yeah, I hope that answers the question.
I would definitely just add to that, and I would totally agree with Heloisa on that one, and definitely you can always get involved. We're trying to work really hard on that at the moment. Like Heloisa was, she mentioned the Invest for Change campaign, which we are currently working on as well. So yeah, there's definitely, like, once we have more the more people we have behind all these projects and kind of initiatives that we want to push for, the kind of more powerful we are as well, and the likely we are to make the change. But even without through the society, you can always email people directly at uni. I've definitely noticed the same, that everyone in Napier, they're very kind of susceptible and really kind of wanting to hear what we as students want to see happening in Napier. So yeah, I would definitely just encourage to get involved with the society through INSA, or then just email directly people at uni. Actually, coming to 7 o'clock now, so that will kind of bring us to the end of this event. Thank you everyone for coming today, for all the questions and kind of sparking the conversation. It's been really, really interesting evening, really interesting conversation, and also a huge thank you for Mark for coming along and presenting all this for us. It wouldn't be possible without you, so thanks very much. And thank you also for Eloisa and Ensa for organizing everything. If people still have questions, or are leaving already, but if everyone has questions, just forward them to the society email. I will pop that in the chat, and we can forward them to Mark if anyone wants to kind of have any further questions or anything like that. But thanks again for everyone. Have a lovely